Hello?
There you go. Okay, it's on. Okay.
Hello? Okay. Okay, hello. Thank you, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you again. This is I think, our biggest gathering so far for Reef Fest. Thank you for sharing your time with us to be here tonight. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces and new faces. I have missed so many of our Reef family over the past 2 years, so it's great to be back together. I'm glad that a lot of you had fun diving this morning and kayaking out on the boats. We've had great weather for that. So in just a few minutes, we're going to get started with the presentation from Ned and Anna. Before we do that, I wanted to take a minute to thank our sponsors for this event. The First Horizon Foundation is our platinum sponsor, so they've made this event possible with all of their financial support. The t-shirts and drinks and masks is all made possible because of that. So we want to thank the sponsors who helped make that possible. And then also our silent auction donors, the organizations that provided for the silent auction, and all of you that have been so generous in bidding on those silent auction items and raffle tickets. So thanks for making that possible. I also wanted to introduce our staff. So our staff and current interns, if you can come up, we'll take just a minute to introduce you to the people that help make all of this possible. A lot of it's been happening behind the scenes. And it's pretty amazing. I started at Reef 10 years ago, and when I started, our team was so much smaller. We could have brought the whole organization up to the stage, and we could have fit in a tiny little space. So it's exciting to see how the organization has grown thanks to your support and thanks to the hard work of all of these people here. Okay, so we'll go down the line. Ali Candelmo, Madeline Moose, Mussy, Amy Lee, Christy Simmons, Stacy Henderson, Jana Nichols, Hillary Penner. She just joined our team 2 weeks ago, so we're especially excited to have Hillary on board. And Dan Greenberg, who just recently joined our team this past year. He's our data guru, doing all the magic with the data behind the scenes. He's going to be giving a presentation tomorrow to share about some of the insights he's gaining with the Reef database. And David, he's another staff member, David Elhart. He's our campus coordinator that's been helping. And the other team members up here are current lead interns and marine conservation interns. So they each spend time helping the organization and moving forward in conservation. So we have Emily and Lauren Mahoney are our current marine conservation interns. And then we have 3 lead interns that have stayed on for a year through the internship program, Summer, Sierra, and Maddie. So this is our full team that's helped to make all this possible. And this year we had 2 donors that generously supported scholarships for intern alumni to come back for this event. So we're turning Reef Fest into the current celebration of conservation that all of us are participating in, but also a homecoming for the interns. So we have, in total, we have 25 intern alumni that are at the event this weekend. If you see anyone wearing a colored bracelet like that, then you'll know that they're part of the intern alumni network. So thanks to our donors that helped make those scholarships possible and all of the intern alumni who came back to celebrate this. And then the last little special group that we want to recognize and thank are our board of trustees. So if you were part of the board, if you could stand up. We have Janet Camp here, Marta Bonatz, Alex Brilski, Scott Happel, Ned and Anna, DeLoach in the front. So thank you for their leadership and guidance over the years as well. So thank you all for coming up. So we'll go ahead and pass it over to Ned DeLoach and Anna, who is our board chair. And they're going to share some stories with us about the early days of Reef, the early days of the Fish ID books and how they first got started in exploring so many different fish species and establishing this organization.
Well, thank you, Martha. Take it away, Anna.
Okay. Great. So you notice that my name is not up here because I I originally was not going to be part of this program. So when we originally planned this evening's program, Jim Dalle Pazze, who is also one of our founding board members, was going to interview Ned and Paul live on stage. And Paul had to have back surgery a month before last, and he's had a very long recovery, and really thought up until a couple of weeks ago that he was going to make it. And he was fine with me telling you all this. So, but anyway, he's getting a lot better, but he wasn't able to travel. So, and then Jim Dalle Pazze, who, in addition to serving on our board all these years, is also a tax attorney. And with all the new changes, he's been really swamped, and he just didn't think he was going to be able to make it. And so a couple of weeks ago, we decided that since 2 of our 3 speakers weren't going to be actually here in person, that we were going to have to pivot, as we've been doing a lot during this pandemic year. And so, you know, we're doing that a lot these days, and we figured we're just going to embrace this new thing and go with it. So why 5,000 fishes? Well, the original idea for this talk was mine because I wanted to talk about this great hunt that Ned and Paul have been on all these years. And the 5,000 started because when I was first learning to identify fish, and I had just only recently met Ned, and I didn't know that much about fish. And I said, well, how many fish could I really see, you know, when I'm diving here? And he said, well, in the Caribbean, 300 to 500 fishes. And that's if you really work at it, you can build your life list. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to go for 500. 500 is my goal. And I asked Ned, I said, well, what's your goal? And he said, oh, 5,000. And so I was like, okay, well, you said 300 to 500 here. I said, I guess that means that you're going to travel around to other places in the world. And he goes, yeah, that's the plan. So that's how we kind of had that goal all these years of 5,000 fishes. So when Paul and Ned's first book was published in 1989, that was the first book they did together. They both had other books before that separately. It was an immediate success in 1989. But what a lot of people don't realize is they both had very different, separate careers in the dive industry for 20 years leading up to 1989. And what I thought was so significant, and the reason I wanted to do this talk, is that everything that, when they came up with the idea for a series of books, and he'll talk to you about how they met and everything, and for the idea of Reef, that 20 years that they had worked previous to that really set them up so that when they had the ideas, they were ready to run with it. And that's why I think the books and Reef have been so successful. So we're going to, just like we kind of, Bryce took us down memory lane with some of the old days, we're going to do that. We're going to back up to pre-1989. So when we realized we're going to have to pivot, let's see. We got David Ehlert and Stacy Henderson, and they took a road trip and went up to Mango Manor. And of course, if you visit Paul at Mango Manor, you're going to get a tour of the garden. So they visited him, and he was there in his office. And then you can see how they kind of stepped in, and we were able to do this and got Ned at our home in Jacksonville. And what I think is really, we're so grateful. We're so grateful for our Reef team, because they were able to take a bunch of really technology challenged boomers and enable us to do this hybrid program that we're going to do for you guys tonight. Now I was able to do this. So this is kind of going back to the theme with Christy and Bryce. It's when I was getting material together for this, kind of my first attempt at a meme, how it started and how it's going. So we're going to start, and so we were able to combine Jim on Zoom and David and Stacy, who shot video of Paul, and I shot some video of Ned, and so we're going to start this off with Jim.
I'm Jim Dalle Pazze with Ref, reporters interviewing famous friends. With me tonight are Paul Humann and Ned DeLoach, 2 individuals who have changed and improved diving and the dive industry as much as any other 2 individuals in the past 30 years. and who have advanced marine conservation more than any two divers in history. Paul was born in Nebraska and raised in Kansas. Ned was born and raised in West Texas, two places without a gallon of ocean water between them. Let's take a look at your separate diving careers before you met in 1985. Long diving careers that ultimately shaped your 36-year joint adventure that has produced a successful guidebook publishing business and one of the leading marine conservation organizations in the world. How did you become a diver?
Well, I was always into swimming and worked my way through college and law school, believe it or not, teaching swimming, coaching swimming, and so on, and made enough money to work your way through school as you could in those days and can't now. And I happened to have a friend that was in college with me that was from Sarasota, Florida. And he says, well, if you can make enough money to come down to Florida in the summer, I'll teach you how to dive. So I drove down, picked him up, and we went down to the Florida Keys, rented a couple of tanks and regulators, and I already had fins and a snorkel. So we decided that we'd go one at a time. And so I got ready to go. I said, okay, what do I do? He says, there's three things to remember. He says, breathe normal, never hold your breath when you come up, and when it starts sinking hard, the tank, that is, come up, because I didn't have gauges in those days. So I made my first dive that way and got hooked, really hooked. And wanted to dive and started diving more and more and started diving abroad. And in those dives away from the U.S., I ultimately dove in Australia, where I dove on one of the world's first liveaboard dive boats. At the time, I was making money as an attorney in Wichita, believe it or not. And I had the idea when I was on those boats, I said, I think I'd rather dive my life away rather than do practice law away.
So you were a successful attorney in love with diving. How did that lead you to buying a dive boat, the Cayman Diver?
And I happened to be in L.A. Doing a closing of a lawsuit and got that ahead of time. And so I called them up in San Francisco and said, hey, I'm in L.A. and they're not expecting me back in Wichita until Monday. So maybe I'll come up and see you over the weekend. So I did. And we went to lunch at a place on the bay there. And we're talking, and I told the travel agent, I said, I love those liveaboard boats. I said, that's the way to go diving. And I said, I'm thinking about quitting the practice of law and doing that. And he looks at me and blinks and he says, well, I was going to take you to the football game here tomorrow, but I'm not. He says, you're getting on an airplane and flying to the Cayman Islands because Bob Soto's got a boat that he was going to turn into a liveaboard and decided not to do it. It interrupted his land operation too much. And he wants to sell it and you need to look into it. And I said, oh, I'm not ready yet. I don't have enough money. He says, get on the plane. Sure enough, I was on a plane on Saturday instead, down to the Cayman Islands and met up with Bob Soto. He shows me the boat, and believe it or not, I loved it. I loved the idea so much. And he says, I can set up everything for you here in the Caymans. I can get you authorization to operate as a foreigner and everything, because he was big in government as well as diving. And before I knew it, I wrote him a hot check for the boat and said, don't cash it till I can get back to Wichita.
How did your family and friends react? And more importantly, how did you know how to run a dive boat?
Needless to say, a lot of people were shocked, some in good ways, some in bad ways. My mother thought I was absolutely crazy to leave the successful practice of law to go run off, to go blow bubbles underwater and run a boat, which she didn't even know that I knew how to run a boat. Well, I sort of did know how to run a boat. I was doing well enough to practice law that I had a twin screw cabin cruiser down on Table Rock Lake. So I knew how to operate a boat that was a twin screw. That's a pretty big deal. All right, how do you navigate? Well, I happen to be an airplane pilot as well. I learned to dive. I learned to fly while I lived in Wichita, Kansas, because that's where Beach and Cessna are. And when you're a kid, you become a pilot if that's at all possible. So I became a pilot. So when I moved to the Cayman Islands, they had to decide that I was capable of being a captain of a liveaboard dive boat. And the port captain had to approve me. I was pretty lucky there, and they gave me my license. And luckily, it all worked out. Didn't sink the boat.
Paul, you and I met in November 1979 when I had my first warm water dive experience after diving off the coast of New Jersey since I was 11 years old in 1963. That warm water diving experience was aboard the Cayman Diver. This is a treasured possession of mine.
That's it. My t-shirt.
My liveaboard experience on the Cayman Diver was absolutely fabulous. Paul was a one-man band. He had a small crew, but he did almost all the work. He was the captain, the dive tour leader, the dive guide, the cook, the purchaser of supplies, the bursar, the organizer and seller of books and other memorabilia, and the entertainment with his nightly slideshow. Paul is certainly the inventor of liveaboard diving in the Caribbean.
And Paul, as I say, as much as anybody, maybe more than anybody, invented the liveaboard dive industry.
Ned, tell us about how you got started in diving.
Well, much as Paul, I was a water rat growing up in West Texas. Just loved the water, crazy about it. I also love natural history, just any kind. Horny toads, bull snakes, whatever. I had a case of them in the garage going all the time. I came up and everything you could do with water, I did. All the Red Cross taught lessons and so forth. And then I joined the swim team. And this picture was in the newspaper. Happened to find this was something Anna put together, bringing back all these old memories. So I haven't shared them with anybody in quite some time. So this is quite the privilege. And I look at these. Why we had our picture in the paper is we all three made the all-state swimming team. We were springboard divers, and out of the 6 finalists, 3 were from San Angelo, and that was a big deal. And so anyway, let's go. Next one. So at that same time, I always had wanderlust. I went to college in Texas Tech, and I majored in physical education. And then after I got out, the draft stared me straight in the face. This was 68. And it was a tough time to be a young man, and we had to make decisions. And I wasn't very keen on going to Vietnam. So I decided to teach school. But my first dream, I said, well, I wasn't the best student in the world, but you needed to go to college. So I went by 4 years to college. But my dream in those 4 years is, as soon as I get out of college, I'm going to get a real education. I'm going to leave the United States for 3 years. I was going to head for South Africa, buy me 1 ticket there and start. And I couldn't come back to the States or come home for 3 years. I was just going to roam. Well, when I got out of college, that wasn't the case. you were going off to Vietnam. You weren't going to South Africa or anywhere. So I decided to teach school, and I got a deferment from teaching school. And so I wanted to wander, but a few people remember or know the fact that young men, you couldn't get a passport if you were eligible for the draft back in those days. I don't even know if that was legal or not, but they sure did enforce it. And you remember some people went to Canada to escape the draft, but I went to the classroom to escape the draft. But my first summer, this teaching was pretty cool because you got 2.5 to 3 months off. And that was going to give me a chance to travel. So the first thing I did soon as the last semester was over, school, I bought a ticket from Miami, Florida, and to Trinidad. And in those days, you could get what they call multi-stopover tickets. I think $279. Boy, and you could not only go to Trinidad, but you could go to every island that they were flying to in between. So for the next 2 months, I bummed around from island to island and had very little money in the pocket, but it didn't matter in those days. You were out and free and living a dream. And I actually started, the first place I went was Cayman Islands. And if any of you have been to Cayman Islands today, it's a beautiful place, but boy, not in 1968. I mean, it was a mosquito capital of the world. And it was just a horrible place to be. And that's before the bank system came over, and they got a lot more sophisticated. They filled in a lot of the wet areas and such. So I started there. Well, in the interim, I went to 13 different islands. And my favorite was when we got to the Eastern Caribbean and went up Dominica, Antigua, all the way up. I finally got to Trinidad and I came home. So this was really living, but sleeping out at night. I remember in St. Vincent going to the botanical garden. Where I slept was under the breadfruit tree that Captain Cook had brought back from his second voyage. And I remember the only clear path I could find turned out to be a goat path. And so that's just the kind of thing you did. And my idea was, don't take any more luggage than you can run with. And that saved me many times. So anyway, I came back. I weaseled my way out of the draft. And so I moved to Jacksonville, Florida. And the reason I came to Florida is I wanted to dive. And I hadn't been diving previously. So I came to Florida, and it was just a wonderful place to be. And I started prowling around the state. Now, you people, I've had people come up and say, well, you've been diving, for 50-something years. Boy, tell us about the good old days of diving. I'm telling you, the good old days of diving are now. I mean, it was tough. There were no facilities or anything. This was a borrowed boat that we used. And actually, this was a night on Molasses Reef. I even remember it. And so I traveled around, and then living in Jacksonville, Florida, we were close to the best freshwater diving in the world in the Florida Springs. And so that's what I started traveling around and seeing the state. And then I decided, well, I got to get some kind of gig besides teaching. And one of the things that always really impressed me was the Audubon Society used to have roving photographers or videographers shooting 16-millimeter films that would come to communities. So I thought I would do that. Little did I know I was right on the edge of the end of that era because television came in. But This is an old card. Anna was able to wrestle this out from the back of the drawer somewhere. And so I started with a crew of friends, New World Productions, and so I needed at least two films. So off to Haiti, I went with two friends. So a month and a half, again, I was teaching school, so this was in the summer, and we made Diving Haiti, where the mountains meet the sea. And then living in Florida, we made Florida's Beautiful Springs. And so we advertised it and went around and were a big failure. So I pivoted and I decided to turn New World Productions into New World Publications, because as I went around, nobody knew where to go diving. The springs, boy, it was just nothing but cow pasture and hardwood hammocks in North Florida, and it was really hard to find places to dive. So all the way to the left, that was my first publication, 48 pages, and I think it sold for all of $2, but it was a hit. It sold out. And so I kept escalating them with these books over the years. Went through 11 editions and put a couple of my kids through college, and served me really well and gave me a lot of diving experience, because things were changing very rapidly in those days. And so I didn't want to just put one book out and the information gets stale. So I was putting out a new one every 3 years. That meant I was riding the roads. So after I came out and I came down to the Keys, spent a summer camping out in the Keys, did a Florida guide to the Keys. That did well. So I started Underwater Florida in about 78, and diving was starting to pick up and things were changing. Now we had boat operators who would take us out. So boy, there was access to the water. Before that, why spring diving was so big is because it was free and so forth. And most of the diving had been beach diving before, and there's not that much beach diving, but there's a heck of a lot of good coastline. So anyway, over the years, that's the way it went. And then I started writing for dive magazines. I found the gig that if you wrote a destination piece for a dive magazine, they actually sent you for free. You didn't make a dime out of it, but you got a free trip. And boy, that was a big bonus. And started going around the Caribbean, and that was really a lot of fun, and it gave me an opportunity to stretch my wings a little bit.
Story that I think is fascinating, and this might give you a clue about what that story is.
That is a story about the flashlight fish, and played a big, big role in my life because I took pictures of it and I had never seen anything like it and had no idea what it was. And it was because we went on a night dive along the wall in Grand Cayman, and we were swimming along, and I looked at what I knew was a cave. And all of a sudden, from inside the cave, the two eye-like things go blink, blink, on and off, on and off. And I go, what the heck? And it turns out I get a flashlight and go over and look, and here's this fish. Well, I had a friend who had a friend that was teaching at a university. And he says, I'm going to tell my friend about this. Well, the next thing I know, I get a call from this guy, and he says, that fish is Cryptophaneron aphrodite. And he says, a live species has never been seen He said, in fact, that fish was described from only 2 dead specimens, one collected in 1919 and another one collected in the 30s. And he says, you've got a big deal there. And he says, I'm going to come down and see this fish and take pictures and some specimens and let the scientific community know about your find. Why that was so important is because I ended up knowing about 3 or well, actually 4 of the top fish scientists in the United States, so that when I found fish or wanted information about fish, I had direct contact with the scientific community. And that helped immensely because although I could take the pictures, there were no books that showed out there all about them, where they were found, how wide were they spread, so on and so forth. And the luck of me finding that fish that he just showed you the t-shirt of is one of the big good things that happened to me because it established the relationship between me and the scientists. And that relationship still carries on today, and I still know these scientists and communicate with them every now and then.
So Ned, while Paul was running the Cayman Diver in the 70s, tell us about your diving adventures during those years.
The diving wasn't too good off Jacksonville, Florida. And so happened to be 90 miles away from the best freshwater diving in the world, as I'd said, and wrote in the first spring guide. And so I turned into a cave diver, and it really worked well because I would get through teaching 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and my buddy and I, we would drive the 90 miles, and cave diving, you can dive at night. It doesn't matter. And so we would make 1, sometimes 2 dives into the caves, and then we would be home by 1:30, 2 o'clock, get up 6:30, teach school the next day, go diving again. Boy, it was some life. It was cool. Well, I was right on the cusp of a very big deal in diving, and that was technical diving. And I happened to fall in with the best cave diving set in the world. And one person I'll talk about is Shek Exley. If you've ever studied tech diving, you know the name Shek Exley. In my opinion, he was one of the greatest explorers of the last century. A lot of people forget about him today, but boy, back then, everybody knew him. He was a great guy. And so when I really I wanted to come out with that first guide to the springs, the cave dive community, such as it was against it. They were really having problems with deaths in caves. Some years we lost as many as 8 divers. Easiest thing in the world to go into a cave. Coming back out can get tough if something happens. And it was really a tragedy. And they said, well, listen, if you publish this book, people will even know our secret places. And so I remember we went to the cave dive section meeting in Gainesville, Florida, Shek and I. He was also from Jacksonville. And we presented the idea, and they just said, no, we don't want you to do it. Coming back, Shek said, no, they've got the wrong idea. What we need is to educate people that want to cave dive, because it is not inherently dangerous if you know what you're doing. And he said, I tell you what, when you publish your book, I will give you all the information you need if you'll promise to always put in a section telling people the danger of diving in caves if you're uneducated. But there is one problem. We don't have any education materials. And he says, I'm going to come up with it. I had my little publishing company. I was a photographer. I was a writer. I had learned by that time I wasn't the caliber of these guys. I mean, I'm telling you, this was a crew. They verged on genius, and they were very dedicated to what they were doing. And there was a couple of times I was diving, and if I had made the decision, I wouldn't be here tonight. And I was like, whoa, I better stop doing this by myself or my buddy, because I just really found out I didn't know that much about it. But these guys, because of my photographic abilities and writing abilities, they said, well, and educational abilities, please help us do the write the book. So the first book came out was Blueprint to Diving, and then the first cave dive manual came out, and that's Shaq on the cover, and that's Jenny Springs back in those days. But Shaq put a whole entire curriculum together and started advertising and telling people that his class was available, and they filled up. And he started teaching other people to teach, and the deaths dropped to virtually nothing. We didn't lose anybody for a 7-year span in one time, even though the number of people in the caves had quadrupled from what they were earlier because of Shaq's idea. So that was a very big thing. But the favorite thing was being with these guys, and especially Shaq. That's Shaq in the middle. I wrote articles and published them in the dive magazines and other magazines about cave diving. And I was on so many adventures, but the greatest adventure was with Shaq. And Shaq was a one-man show. He didn't thrive on publicity. He just thrived on being the best in the world. And he was the best in the world, not only in cave penetration, but in depth. Now, depth requires a lot of technology. There was no such thing as mixed gases. The cave dive community in the United States are the ones that came up with the mixed gases. They came up with using oxygen in the caves. And I was with them every step of the way. And it was really exciting because they were able to dive deeper and they were able to penetrate the caves further. But one spring break, actually, Shaq's dad owned a car dealership, and he made Shaq the manager, and Shaq hated it, could not stand it. He wanted to be in the caves all the time. So he kind of took the hint. He said, well, I like the idea that you got the couple of months off every summer and a couple of weeks off at Christmas. That sounds like some freedom to me. So he started teaching school in Spring Country, bought him a trailer house that was about 25 yards from the opening into the aquifer. So he owned his own cave system. And he often would dive alone. But the deepest the caves got in Florida were about 300 to 380 feet. We bottomed them out regularly. So Shaq wanted to go deeper. So he first tried in the Bahamas to go down in the clear water, but currents were a bad thing. And he didn't feel comfortable in the open ocean. So he wanted to dive down and decided to make a deep dive in the cave. It would be safer for him to do. So he had discovered this cave in northern Mexico and Ciudad Monte, south of Monterrey, Mexico. And he and a friend had been in Mexico and had gone down about 400 feet in the cave. And Shaq remember looking down, and it just kept going. This is where he wanted to go. So he called me up one day and said, will you go with me to Mexico? I want to set a record. He said, I don't know how deep I can go, but I'm going to try to go over 500 or 600 feet. And this was kind of unimaginable. But what he had done is he'd taken some diving decompression records and jiggered them a little bit. And he had the magic of mixed gases. And so he was going to dive over 500 feet. And so the two of us, he invited me to go. So I went over. It was spring break. We had 10 days to pull this thing off. We drove all the way through Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, all the way to the border, and then down south into Mexico till we came to this beautiful, beautiful cave system outside this little town of Ciudad Monte. And Shaq, in the back of his van, he had 30 tanks. And he and I helped stage him to about 300 feet, and he staged them all the way. I helped him stage to about 100 feet, and then he staged them himself down to 300 feet. This took us 2 days. So here's Shaq. He was going to go set this record. Well, I could do nothing at that time but wish him luck. And I swam with him to the entrance, and I watched him go down, and I followed him as far as I could, about 100 feet, and watched his light disappear. Well, they had a line into 300 feet, so he went down to 300 feet, and he tied a line off to that. And this was new territory for himself and humanity. And in those days, how deep you go, the only depth gauge we could get would go to 300 feet. That was it. So Shaq had a way to measure it with the line he put down. So he disappeared into the darkness and went down, and he went down. And I was up waiting for him. Well, as it turned out, he went 780 feet. And he tied off, and he came back. Took him 20 minutes to go 780 feet. It took him 11 hours to decompress. I mean, you know what your skin turns into when you're in the water that long. Man, this was a feat. But he told me when he came out, I remember he came out of the water. I was waiting for him by the side. He reminded me of The Old Man in the Sea, Hemingway's favorite novella after the Santiago had battled the shark. He was just totally wasted. But he insisted. He didn't allow me to even help him out of the water. And he had all these tanks on and so forth, and staggered back to the car. And he just said, so I said, well, how deep did you go? He says, I don't know. I'll have to measure what cord that I have left. And so he took and minused what he tied off, and it had gone 780 feet. And the next day, he was chipper, up packing, and we headed back. And I remember asking him as we pulled out of Ciudad Monte, I said, Check, are you going to ever do it again? And he just kind of gave me a half smile, and he said, I don't know. Well, he did. He had many feats beyond that. Ultimately, he passed away in a cave at 1,000 feet several years later. But a gem of a guy. And boy, it was nothing like being with the best in the world. If you can't be the best, be with the best in the world. And I was during that time, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
An underwater photographer before you bought the Cayman Diver, and continued during the years you ran the boat and after you sold it?
Well, I had already taken pictures good enough that I had actually been published in Dive magazine, and even had one picture in National Geographic, believe it or not. And so I thought, well, I'm going to be a good underwater photographer. And the divers would keep coming back up on the boat, and they'd say to me, Paul, what was that fish I saw? I don't know what that fish was. And I go, well, I don't know either. I said, next time I go up to Miami, I'm going to buy some good fish books so we can look it up and check it out. Well, I go up to Miami, where we got a lot of our supplies because you couldn't get them all at Cayman, and looked around and found out There weren't any such things. The only books out there were basically with drawings by scientists and some pictures of dead fish laying on a dock. That doesn't do it for you if you're underwater. So all of a sudden I said, well, rather than be a general photographer, I'm going to take a picture of every species of fish that I can while I'm still living here in the Cayman Islands. Back in the 80s, when I was trying to make enough money to survive before we did our books, I was leading trips to Galapagos. And I was one of the top so-called dive guides to Galapagos and could take groups of 10 to 12 divers to Galapagos, as many as 4 or 5 times a year. And I did that. I don't even know how many times I went to Galapagos. And that's how I got this huge collection of fish from Galapagos.
So while I was putting this together and looking at all the things that Paul and Ned had done in the 60s and 70s and mid 80s, I found a bunch of other old stuff too. So I found this VHS tape, The Fabulous Florida Springs, with your host, Ned DeLoach. So Ned did actually do another film, even though the first 2 failed. And then on our wall in the office, Ned has a bunch of pictures tacked up there with thumbtacks. And he's always said, well, I also made a cave diving film with several good friends. But he never really told me much of the story about it. But so I had that picture on the wall, and then there he is doing some filming topside. And this was in Mexico, right? So, and then this old thing was tacked up, or is tacked up, on his wall in the office, but I never put much together and really never knew the origin of this piece of paper until I found another old VHS tape. And I'm going to show you, this is the film from, I'm only going to show about a minute of it, but this was the cave diving film that Ned and his friends Clark Pitcairn and Guy Beard made in 1986, somewhere, yeah. It's a really old copy.
Their light is the first to shine into the future as it follows an uncharted path toward destiny. Following in this tradition are cave divers. They have creatively adapted modern diving technology, allowing them to go where no one dared imagine just a few decades past. The divers glide effortlessly through a fall of trees at the basin's edge and into Cristal's black expanse. From their underwater lights, bright halogen beams play in a forest of stalactites, evidence that the cave had once been dry. The divers are now 60 feet under the jungle and over 900 feet into the system. Here they will abandon the permanent line in the main corridor to take a side passage. The entire ceiling span in the west wing is jeweled with crystal tears. Spiked soda straws, fragile as ice, drip from above by the thousands.
It's just an excerpt, but if you look, I was looking at the credits, and it's a who's who of the cave divers back in the 80s, so it was a lot of fun to watch that. I'm going to try to see if we can get a better copy at some point. So Paul was also in multimedia, and I found this. I found an old VHS. Actually, I found it in Paul's office. He actually starred in a Mutual of Omaha Spirit of Adventure program on ABC Sports, and he took Peter Benchley, the author of Jaws and other books, took him to the Galapagos and went diving. It's really a hoot to watch. And I don't know if you can even buy it anymore, but we had a bad copy. I don't have any of that to share tonight. But last year I spent a couple of months scanning all of Ned's old magazine articles, and I found that he actually had an encounter with Peter Benchley also. So Ned, you tell us about that and how you met Paul.
Well, I got more and more into writing for dive magazines, and so one of the things that I loved more than any other was a feature, a profile of famous divers. So I was sent around again with no pay, but a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of fun. And I interviewed Peter Benchley among many other luminaries of the time. And one of the magazines was a new one on the horizon called Ocean Realm magazine, a slick covered publication. In that time, there was only one dive magazine, and that was Skin Diver, and that was it. And so I was writing for the satellite publications, including Ocean Realm, and the gentleman that was publishing it got in some financial trouble, and so they sold it. And they happened to sell it to a publishing house in Jacksonville, Florida. And so I lived in Jacksonville. That's where I was still teaching school. So they asked if I would be willing to edit the magazine. This is the break I wanted. This is what I had been longing for. So I said, certainly, and came out with the first edition, and it did quite well. But there was a problem. I was single at the time, but I was lucky. I was raising my two kids, and this was a lot of effort to pull off the magazine. Well, by very good fortune, a cave dive friend, you might have heard his name, Clark Pitcairn. Clark had been on the Cayman Diver. And he said, I met this guy that has published a couple of fish books. His name's Paul Humann, and you just got to meet him. I think you guys would get along. So Clark set up a trip over to dive with the manatees, and Paul came along with some other people. And I liked Paul a lot, and I listened to his stories at night, especially his fishy ones, and they were very, very intriguing. So I got on the phone, and he was living in Hollywood, Florida at the time, and I said, Paul, this is Ned DeLoach. We were together a few weeks ago. I told him about Ocean Realm. He says, I know, I've already seen a copy of it. I said, would you like to come up and be co-editor with me? I'll handle the words and you handle the pictures. So Paul came up, and the magazine was a bi-monthly magazine, and it came out. Just happened that the dive industry was getting tired of Skin Diver magazine. It was, you had to pay a lot of money to get in there, and it was to buy advertisement, to get any promotion and such. And it was impossible for new destinations to get started and such. So our idea was to help the new people out that were opening, and if they made it, they would advertise with us. Well, the industry bought it. And Paul had friends in networking. He called his friends. We got the best content going, including Chris Newberg, all for free. Advertisement flooded in because this was, people were in the industry were very impressed. And by the fourth edition, we were breaking even in that magazine and doing very well. And I found out I've worked very well with Paul. We were having a lot of fun doing this. Well, in this interim, Paul showed me his gallery of pictures from the Cayman Islands. I had always wanted to know how to ID books, a fish, and I bought the scientific books. But just like Paul had said earlier, they just didn't help you very much. And so we decided to put together a fish ID for divers. And that's where the idea came up.
So I I was looking around for notes and all kinds of stuff in the files from from when they first started doing the book, and this is how Reef Fish ID started, in a yellow notebook. And so I haven't scanned the whole notebook yet, but I just thought I'd share some of these because I got a real kick out of them. So this was the very first page in that yellow notebook, and this is Ned's handwriting in this page, but it's kind of, laying out their ideas for the different fish ID groups. And I don't know what the money is up there, except I know you borrowed from your mom when you had to do the book. So I'm guessing that might have been something with payment plans or something. I don't know. And then I like the titles of the chapters because the traditional books before that were all, I think, evolutionary order. This is the way they're ordered in the books. And Ned and Paul, I heard a lot of stories over the years of how they had to sit there and really struggle to find the different groups, and because they wanted this to be friendly for divers, where you could look at a fish and then go in and find, like, we have disc-shaped and small ovals and broad-bodied, prominent lips, and that ended up being heavy-bodied, large lips groupers, I think. I saw a number of iterations of that particular chapter, so I think you struggled with that one. But anyway, so it was kind of fun to go through this to see how this book was born, their first books. And a lot of drawing here, a lot of notes, and more chapters, more ideas on the chapters, and more notes. And Ned is obviously not an artist. I like the eels. I got a big kick out of the eel page. Yeah, morays, gardens, and snake eels. So that was a lot of fun. But as you go further into the notebook, you can see it's starting to take shape, and you see that the table of contents now they're drawing that out, and some more ideas for the layout. And here, so we went from a sketch in the yellow notebook to the Fish ID book. So tell us how it went.
Well, there we are. Knowing not what we were doing, but we had a lot of enthusiasm. I had the education background. I knew from teaching that people learn in different ways. What we were trying to do is take these several hundred fish and simplify them, make it easier a reference book to use, a reference tool. So this is in 1989 at the DEMA show in Orlando, which happened to be very just for us because the publisher we had chose was in Orlando. And actually, the first books that we sold still were wet with ink. And so we didn't have any idea. There was Paul and I. The fellow on the right was the photographer that also helped us, Mike Bacon from West Palm. And I was talking my head off. I mean, these books sold. We couldn't believe it. We were the hit of the whole DEMA show because it wasn't just the book that we came out with. You'll see on the bottom right, we came out with reef notes for people to keep their diving log. And I had the idea of writing a curriculum that dive shops could use to teach people how to identify fish. It hadn't even been written, but we were selling them. And we were really, really doing well. And we just were running out of books. We called the press. They delivered more. I don't know how many hundreds of books we sold, orders that went into the thousands. And here we were, Paul living off his credit card ever since he had left the Cayman diver, me a poor school teacher. And so after the DEMA show, we just were tired as we could be. And I remember we went out over to the hotel, packed up, and we were sitting out in front, and we had cash. We felt like drug dealers. I mean, so we started divvying it up. And then we made one of the wisest decisions we had ever made, I think. And we made many wise decisions along with some pretty Herculean mistakes. But this was not to touch the money. We're going to, you keep living off your credit card, I'll keep teaching school, because Paul had the idea of doing not one book, but 3 books, an invertebrate book and also a coral book. And so that is what we did. And so we dedicated our time, and Paul working full time at home, and I working all my spare time. And so the books were really doing well. I had the publishing house set up, New World Publications, from my dive guide to Florida, that was still doing well. And so I had a network. And we had another good idea: no middlemen. We weren't going to give this to a publisher because they get so much money. So we decided we'll do the whole thing ourselves. I had been selling Underwater Florida out of my garage for almost 20 years at that time. So we decided we would sell our books and didn't have a middleman. Well, that cut us out from the bookstores and the libraries and so forth, until a young man that we hired right out of college, my son-in-law, Eric Reese, that's with us, still runs the company today. He went to a book convention, and at that time he saw that they were asking for applicants for the book of the year. And we sent our new 2nd edition of Reef Fish Identification to them, and lo and behold, we won for the best reference book in the United States that year. Well, we were picked up by Barnes & Noble and Ingram, and boy, it was glory from then on out. Now, you see the Reef logo in the background. Well, one thing Paul and I found out, they knew so little about this natural history of the underwater world. And we were trying to find out what the ranges of the fishes. The scientists had very vague ideas. Oh, yeah, some of them are in Puerto Rico. Some of them, I think, they go all the way to Dominica and such as that. Well, that wasn't good enough information. So it dawned on me one day, we'll do what the bird watchers are doing. We'll start an organization. The bird watchers have been so successful gathering data. And whenever they were trying to close down wetlands, they had proof to substantiate the damage it was doing to the wild bird populations and such. And so that came the idea of Reef. But in the middle, that is Jim Dalle Pazze, our host this evening. And there would not be a Reef if it wasn't for Jim. And because Paul and I were so overwhelmed with work and success at that time, starting a nonprofit organization just was a mile too far, maybe 100 miles too far. But Jim insisted we do it, went home and incorporated us as Reef, and look at us today. Here we are. So
since you started Reef, Paul and Ned, you have had many diving experiences and many exciting finds underwater and on land. Tell us about those.
I think some of the most exciting finds I had is when I started diving in Galapagos, because there you can see schools of fish like this shirt of rays and all kinds of things in huge groups like you'll see them no place else in the world, and photograph them. And I think some of those schools of fish in Galapagos were some of the most exciting things I've experienced, because not only did they include things like the rays, they included hammerhead sharks. Ned and Anna and I led, I can't even tell you how many dive trips around different spots in the world. And then we heard about Indonesia, which a part of Indonesia has more species of fish than any other single place in the entire world.
So I'm going to ask Ned, you tell us a few of your favorite stories and fishes you've seen and since the books first came out.
Okay, we were after 5,000 fish. So one thing we learned when the first book came out, we thought it was very comprehensive. Well, it was very comprehensive for Cayman Islands, where Paul had spent 9 years running his boat. But as soon as I started diving and using the book as a tool, I was seeing a lot more fish than what we had in that first edition. Well, we were making too much money. Somebody else was going to come in and sucker us if we didn't work hard. So that's when we came up with the second edition. So the hunt for new species was on. This is a black brochula. In our first book, this is a fish that wasn't in there. We didn't have a fish. So we were on the hunt for a black brochula, and they were off of the Fort Lauderdale area, and we went out 3 different nights. This is looking for the fish, couldn't find it. And then we led one of the trips Paul was talking with friends down to St. Vincent Island, and we had an embarrassment of brochulas. They were everywhere. On one dive, we saw as many as 6. And so that was some thrill and taught us a good lesson. And then we were over in Indonesia. I think of our books, and I hope other people do, as dream books. You go through them, and I want to see that one. I want to see that one. I have to see that one. Well, when we got to Indonesia, we're not talking about hundreds of fish. We're talking about thousands of fish. So we buddied up with an Australian, Roger Steen, and an American that worked at Perth, ichthyologist named Jerry Allen. And we teamed up with them because they had been shooting fish over there. But they certainly didn't have a complete component for the books. So the hunt was on. And one picture that we had seen, and that was a spike fin goby, little guy, 1-inch guy, but a gorgeous fish. It struck my imagination. And I remember our first trip to Rajan Pot. It was the end of the night dive. I was starting to suck the rust out of the bottom of the tank, and I was actually turning over rocks looking for sarin shrimp and a spike fin goby. Oh, the thrill. You know the thrill. I was so excited, and 2 things were happening. I was sucking the rust down. That wasn't a very good sign. But this little guy did not want to be photographed. And the bugs were swarming and coming in. And that guy, you see the big pec fins? Why he has them, he would just dig right down into the sand. And my dive guy, Ollie, would reach under and lift him up, and he'd dive down again. And so Ollie grabbed it in his hand. We swam over to the edge where rocks were, and he said, "We'll just put him on a rock." That was our underwater thinking. He put him on a rock, and he dived in a little hole. And we finally got him out, and I was out of air by this time, had no idea that I had the picture at all, and but we got him. But what a thrill that one was. And then Anna and I, of course, always dive as a team, and there's a group of fish called flasher wrasse, and these are just absolutely the epitome of natural selection. We've got the male peacock on land. We have flasher wrasse underwater. These guys are show-offs. It is not good to be a show-off if there's a predator around. So this is quite a group of fish, and they're just lovely. And nobody had a complete set. At the time, there were supposed to be 20 flashers, but we started, and what we would do is these fish, the only time that they're beautiful like this is when they're spawning. They happen to spawn every evening about between 4 and 5 o'clock. The problem was they were down about 60 feet, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd already made 3 dives, and you had to go down 60 feet. watch your decompression. And these guys are going like bullets, from little harem to harem of females. And back in the film days, you had 36 exposures. You didn't know whether you had them or not. But it was a hoot, and we had a lot of fun with them. And so they're solemn. So as we were diving, other people were, this is a blue flasher. And stop on that one. This was quite a discovery we made in famous Limbe Strait. This is a round fin flasher. They're very rare. They were only known from the Cayman Islands. It was 180 miles south of there. And yet we found them in Limbe. And that was a real thrill. And then we actually, Anna found a flasher that we took a picture of. This was digital days. We sent it to Jerry Allen, and he said, catch one, because this is a new species. And we did, with the help of the dive guides. We went down with a homemade spear and speared them, and it turned out to be a new flasher to add to the set. And Anna asked the describer, Jerry Allen, to name it after our dive guide, because these Indonesian dive guides were indispensable. So we were adding to the list, which was a great, great thrill. And sharp-eyed Anna finds a fairy wrasse. It's beautiful. And Sarah Laborous, and Jerry asked her who she would want to name it after, and she named it after Paul, for all he had done. So we were now really cutting edge, finding new species. And then last was this little guy. I was in Bali going down 50 feet. We just happened to, we were in Talamban at the time, but the week before we'd been in Secret Bay, and we saw a little fang blenny. Of course, Anna's crazy about blennies, and so we couldn't identify it. And we found out it was a Smith's fang blenny, which was a big range extension. And that's what we were doing, trying to gather knowledge. And so I was at Talamban a few days later and going down, and I saw a head poking out of the sand and disappeared. So I just lay on the bottom, and I lay there for about 40 minutes. And he finally came out. I took a picture of it, and we sent it to our friend Mark Erdman at Conservation International, got us one. And ultimately, we were leaving that day, and Conservation International came back, and they caught it. And so that's a Delatremus DeLoach. And so that was a great thrill.
So go ahead. I was just going to say, I think the question is, where are we with the 5,000 fishes?
Oh, Anna, I have no idea, but it has been a kick in the britches all the way. Thank you very much.
Studios here in Jacksonville. Our thanks to Anna DeLoach, our producer and director extraordinaire, and Stacy Henderson, our production geniuses, the three who have made this production possible. Thank you, Paul and Ned, for taking us again on yet another wonderful journey. And thank you to all our Reef members for your tremendous support of Reef. Enjoy the rest of Reef Fest. Let me leave you with one thought. Vaccinated or not, whenever you dive, be sure to wear your mask. Thank you, and good night.
Thought we were going to be starting an hour ago.
Thank you all very much, and I really appreciate it.
Are you okay to take some questions?
Yes, oh yeah, yes.
You answer some?
Yeah, you answer.
Oh, get the microphone here. I saw him.